And then while we're still in a meditative mode, let's just take now a few minutes. We'll kind of stay in meditative mode, contemplative meditation here, in order to do a little bit of contemplation to develop our motivation for this class and for the series of classes. So particularly here we'll do one of the two meditations for generating bodhicitta in a kind of brief, simplified way. And start with the recognition that just as much like we can feel in our own experience how I want to be happy. Each of us, we feel this, right? I want to be happy. I don't want to suffer. And we can think about how, in a very general way, everyone is the same, right? We can start by thinking that everybody on this Zoom call is the same in that way. All the other people on this call, exactly as much as me, at least, the same way they want to be happy, same way they don't want to suffer. There's no difference at all. All the people in my neighborhood are the same, right? Wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. People who I like friends or family members, have that wish in exactly the same way as myself, and exactly the same way as people I dislike. Just as deeply, those people want to be happy and don't want to suffer. Right now, in the US, it's very easy, right? Anybody can, you think of certain people, then you can feel some aversion. The nation's so polarized, right? So those people also, right, towards whom I feel aversion, for sure they want to be happy and don't want to suffer. And then there are so many people I ordinarily ignore, feel disconnected from, don't even think of. Sometimes it can almost seem like, I don't recognize their humanity. They also, just as much as me, want to be happy, not to suffer. There's no difference in that sense. So all human and non-human beings are the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. We can just contemplate for a moment, as Shanti Deva points out, right? That it's like heartbreaking, totally unbearable, right? Everybody wants to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer. And yet if we look around at ourselves and others, we can see, right, that we don't want to suffer, but we're all creating causes of suffering. Like generating greed, generating hatred, pride, arrogance, jealousy. Generating self-centered attitudes. that give rise to all those afflictive emotions. So we don't want to suffer. But if we look around, then mostly all people are doing is creating causes of suffering. And we all want to be happy, right? But it's like we're stomping on the causes of happiness. We totally neglect them or destroy the causes of happiness for ourselves and for each other. And if we actually contemplate that self-centered attitude, right, that puts myself first, that sees myself as separate and as more important, right, then that gives rise to craving, to greed, then to anger at others for not doing what I want them to do, right, and so on. Pride, and jealousy, hatred, and so on, right? So if we contemplate, right, like how everybody's the same, wanting to be happy, yet we don't see that, and out of this self-centered, self-centered attitude, we create so many causes of suffering. The self-centered attitude that gives rise to all the problems in relationships, problems in families, gives rise to problems in society. I kind of look at how that functions in our own, each of us, in my own life and in the lives of others. And you feel like sickened by the self-centered attitude. You begin to feel like the purpose of my life is to abandon that. Is to live in the recognition of everyone's fundamental equality. Everyone's equal in wanting happiness, equal in not wanting suffering, equal in having Buddha nature, right? The potential to become enlightened. So the idea that I would neglect some people becomes unbearable. The idea that I would hate some people becomes unbearable. Like the purpose of my life is to cherish others, is to love, and to have compassion. And we recognize then because all good things, the good things in relationships, good things in society, good things karmically for myself in this life and in future lives, all the way up to Buddhahood itself, right, come from caring about others, cherishing others, which means loving them. Having compassion for the suffering of others. So the purpose of my life is actually that, right, is to give up, to abandon, to let go of the self-centered attitude, and to gradually cultivate limitless love, limitless compassion, a limitless heart cherishing others. And ultimately, right, the purpose of my life, my existence, is to become enlightened in order to be able to benefit others. And according to the teachings of the Buddha, right, the only way to liberate myself and others from suffering is through wisdom that overcomes ignorance. So my purpose for studying tenets then, right, in Buddhist tenets, is in order to develop that wisdom, right? Develop the liberating wisdom to free myself and others from the cause of suffering, which is ignorance. So we can just like generate a resolve now, right? Out of love, out of compassion, out of the bodhicitta, right? The wish to become enlightened for the welfare of all beings. For that purpose, I'll study tenets. There's a deep purpose to it. It's not just an intellectual exercise, it's to free others and also myself from suffering and its causes. Mm. And with that kind of motivation in our hearts, then we can recite the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Nice to see everybody. Yeah. Let's see. I'll start by saying, today, is the first in this series, right? And it's part of the, and I'll say a couple quick orientation comments. One is, we're studying tenets, Buddhist tenets, and this is also for those who want. It's just some people have been doing this in an ongoing way. Anybody who wants to, it's offered through Guya Samaja Center, right? But so, since that's part of FPMT, if anybody wants to participate in this as part of the FPMT's basic program, you can, but you have to just attend most of the classes and do the reading and so on. And then, when we get near the end of the class, you'll have to let me know that you did that and so on, and you can get like a completion certificate. I've been trying to get better at keeping up on that. So I'm not always good at those kind of administrative things, but okay, that's that. And then the other thing is we're using our primary text, which I'm going to talk about, which we're going to go through, and is Jetson Chogi Geltson's text called The Presentation of Tenets, or the full Presentation of Tenets, I guess is the title. And we had a copies, Venerable Dondrup just put a Google Drive with all the texts there. So there's some charts as well. So everybody's welcome to download those. I guess we had them up kind of easy on the website, but FPMT said, we shouldn't just leave them out on the website. So, but everybody who's taking the class is welcome to download copies of the PDF. And the link is in the chat. And if you can't get, for any reason you have trouble getting it there, if you email Venerable Dondrup or myself, you can get a copy of the root text. Maybe I'll start with this. I'll start in a very general way. I was thinking about the word tenets, right? Like this idea. So And in Tibetan, it's drupta. And I'll share, I was looking at different commentaries, and what they say is like the word drupta in Tibetan, it means established conclusions. Or so the word drup means to establish, and ta means like limit. But limit really could be the way they usually, in English, to say it, it would be a conclusion. And I want to bring that up to start with, right? So this idea of established conclusions, what does that mean? Right? I was like, okay, what does it mean? Or you're going to study tenets, but what does it even mean, tenet, right? And what they're getting at there is, I think, quite important, which is tenets means to establish a conclusion means you've thought about something, and that you've come to a conclusion through a process of reasoning, through a process of introspective analysis, or deeply thinking through something. And they make a point about that, which I wanted to sort of talk about to start with. I thought it was a good place to begin. Is they say actually there are two types of beings in this sense, in reference to tenets. One is there are beings who never, who are uninfluenced by tenets. That's how they say it. Usually when the translators will say there are sentient beings who are uninfluenced by tenets. And then there are sentient beings who are influenced by tenets. And kind of think about that for a moment, because actually I think about, like, what does it mean to be uninfluenced by tenets? Right? And I want to say that because it's worth, actually, if you're on this class, you're not that person most likely, right? You're not somebody who's uninfluenced by tenets already, or you wouldn't come to this class most likely, right? Because to be uninfluenced by tenets, I often meet people like this, actually. I mean, I'm not really sure. I think a large percentage of US citizens are uninfluenced by tenets. What that means is the person never asks ultimate questions, right? They don't ask, like, how do things exist? What's the nature of existence? What's the purpose of life, right? And that's where, like, I can think of, I work as a psychologist, and there are often times where I'll say to somebody, well, what are your values? Like, what are your most deeply held values? And the person goes, I don't know. Like, or why did you take that career? I don't know. It was like, it's what came along, right? Somebody told me it was a good way to make the most, make money. Or somebody offered me a job, right? Why did you do this? Why did you, the person hasn't thought about those things in the context of ultimate meaning. Does that make sense? Like, what's the ultimate nature of existence? What's the ultimate purpose of existence? How do things exist? And why and why should I do what I do? So this idea of tenets implies that we've asked a question of meaning and of the nature of existence, a question about how do things exist and what's the purpose of our life too. So I just wanted to pause first and think about that, right? So think about, like, so people or beings who are uninfluenced by tenets, right? That means you're just, this word, like, just going about, like, what's the word? They sometimes say, like, just concerned with the affairs of this life. But even then, actually, there are some people who are just concerned with the affairs of this life, but who are, at least have some kind of, have asked the question at least, right? Have come to some conclusion like that. Maybe they're a nihilist, for example. Nihilists are influenced by tenets, actually. Does that make sense? If you came to a conclusion of nihilism where you thought about it, from a Buddhist perspective, that's completely wrong. It's the worst, most terrible of belief systems, or one of the most terrible, I guess. But a nihilist is influenced by tenets in the sense that they've asked the question. They've said, what ultimately is the nature of existence? And they say, nothing has any meaning, or things don't truly, things don't exist at all, and karma doesn't exist, whatever, morality doesn't exist. That's a wrong understanding, but that's influenced by tenets. But so somebody who's uninfluenced tenets doesn't ask those questions, or doesn't contemplate them deeply. And I'll say one last thing about it, then I'll drop that topic. But it's true, isn't it? Like, if you think about it, you come across, if you actually think about it, in this culture anyway, I think you often come across people where, like, maybe when somebody died, they thought about like a person thought about that for a few minutes at a funeral, but then they, whatever, moved on to the next thing. And there are just a lot of people like that, aren't there, who just don't ask those questions. And part of what we're getting at is like, if you're Buddhist, right? If you're interested in Buddhism, well, first of all, if you're interested in Buddhism and you're in this, and you didn't, what's the word? If you're living in this country and you're influenced in Buddhism, then most likely you're influenced into you're somebody who's influenced by tenets, because otherwise, why in the world would you come to a class like this? You wouldn't be interested in that. But what we're trying to do as Buddhists, actually, and through this kind of study, is get really good at asking those questions. Does that make sense? To make sure we come to the correct conclusions to those questions, and not to incorrect conclusions to those questions. Because those questions actually are the most important questions, aren't they? How do things exist? What's the purpose of our life? So it could seem, and I'm saying all of that, first of all, that's true. I mean, it's how Buddhists present it, right? They're being influenced by tenets and being uninfluenced by tenets. And I'm saying all this in part because, if you just read this text, actually, without thinking deeply about it, which seems kind of funny to do, given that the whole purpose of it is to think deeply in this sense. But this is right. You could think this is just an intellectual exercise, right? You could think it's an intellectual exercise, like as if Buddhists are playing games, right? Like, oh, well, what's the nature of existence? And this school says this, and that school says that, and so on. But actually, what this is really is the most important topic. It's actually, in some ways, the most important of topics, isn't it? It's like, how do things exist, and what's the purpose of my existence? That's what Tenets is asking. So it's humongously important then, right? It's not just an intellectual exercise. And as we do this exercise, there are times where we're trying, I think sometimes we can get confused by this, like where it's like, there are times where you're just trying to understand, well, what does this school say, right? And there, of course, it takes some intellectual effort to understand, well, what is a school that was maybe, in some cases the texts were written, began 2,500 years ago and were written soon after that, or a few hundred years after that, rather, and so on, whatever. But I guess they were oral traditions initially, so they were written down later. But my point is, it's like, it could seem like, oh, it's just studying some old idea from, centuries ago. But if we approach tenets correctly, what we're really asking is, do I understand the nature of my own existence and the world correctly or incorrectly? And am I living my life in a way that's correct? And I'll say a couple more things. Like, one is, I just think it's wonderful to ask those questions. So that's my own opinion. But then also, one is, I guess I want to say two more things. One is, from a Buddhist perspective, if you get the answer to these questions right, you become enlightened. Right? A Buddha is somebody like, I mean, Khenpo Rinpoche was teaching a couple of years ago. I think it was Dharmakirti's text on pramana, valid cognition. And what he pointed out is, what is a Buddha, right? What Dharmakirti was saying, what is a Buddha? Khenpo Rinpoche was pointing, what is a Buddha? And he said, it's somebody who's valid, right? Who sees things as they are. Right? And part of the Buddhist idea is actually that's a unique quality of a Buddha, right? That they only see things as they are. And I remember getting very disturbed when Khenpo Rinpoche points out, and like, we who are non-Aryas, they call it, right? Of an Arya is somebody, Arya is a Bodhisattva, Arya is somebody who's seen emptiness directly in Buddhism, right? So if you're a non-Arya, meaning somebody who's not seen emptiness directly in the Buddhist sense of that word, then we've never seen anything in an entirely valid way. And we're thinking, that's really kind of disturbing. So the question of tenets is, what's valid, right? Is, how do you see reality as it is? And one more just side point. This is, again, I try to be clear when I go off on tangents. I'm gonna do a very short tangent. From a Buddhist perspective, the attainment of liberation and enlightenment is this is required, right? To see things correctly is required to become enlightened. But then even in a worldly sense, right now, I mean, I think our current world circumstances, I think can serve as a reminder of many things, many disturbing things. But one of them is the use of asking these kinds of questions, right? There is because, what is the word? Seeing things correctly and seeing things truly matters. And seeing things incorrectly and falsely matters. Right? And the more falsely you see things, the more dangerous you are. Right? And the more correctly you see things, the less dangerous you are to yourself and others. So there's a moral component to seeing things correctly, and if to the extent that we don't know how to question our own perceptions, actually it's really disturbing, isn't it? We become dangerous. And so Buddhism is trying to teach us to become better at questioning our own perceptions. And actually, that's a good transition to another point I wanted to raise. So the first one, right, about the first general Buddhist point I raised was there are beings who are uninfluenced by tenets and beings who are influenced by tenets. We're obviously in this class going to focus on beings influenced by tenets, right? Then in Buddhism, they categorize two general types of tenet systems. One is, actually, I think it's interesting. Like, I'm going to go off on again a short tangent. They usually say, in English, we usually say non-Buddhist tenets and Buddhist tenets. But actually, I'm sort of been contemplating this a little bit lately, that in Tibetan, they don't use a word that means Buddhist. Right, so that's like, and I think I've been a little disturbed by that recently as I've been sort of thinking about, to some extent, I'm just going to go off on a short tangent here for a second. To some extent, even these words we use, using the word Buddhism is fine, right? But actually those terms, like, it's interesting, in Tibetan, they say insider tenets and outsider tenets, right? Those are the Tibetan terms they use. And insider actually doesn't, like, the way lamas who I've spoken, who say, I ask, what does that mean? And they say, it means somebody who focuses inside themselves. If you're Buddhist, you're supposed to focus on inside your own mind, right? And if you're not Buddhist, then you're usually focused outside, right? On God or creator, somebody outside, some kind of outside force or matter, something like that, right? And so actually the Tibetan term has a deep meaning, right? Insider means you focus inside on the nature of your own mind, right? And on training your mind. So that's what, and I think like this idea, so we say Buddhist, right? And I just think, wow, first of all, we missed something of the Tibetan term is one point. But then another is, I was thinking recently, like I was reading, I was reading a couple books about Orientalism. And maybe people already knew this, but I was sort of disturbed by that a lot of these terms, actually they were talking about how the terms Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, were created by Orientalists as part of imperialism. And I was sort of like, wow, I hadn't really thought about that. Right? Really as ways to categorize in order to control non-white people, to be honest. And that's a little disturbing, So we use terms that were created out of imperialistic, racist, efforts by European countries, European people. And so when I say, so I'm just like, I'm hesitant now. I say non-Buddhist, and I'm like, well, that's a little funny term. Then I prefer maybe, anyway. So I think it's useful. I'm going to still say Buddhism, of course, but sometimes. But what I want to say is that it's more useful to think of it as insider. I just think that's a more beautiful expression, meaning focus inside yourself. Right? But anyway, so among the, so we're going to study what are these, and I want to say another thing too. So there are many, many texts about tenets in the Tibetan tradition, and from India too. There are texts that address these issues. And one thing I was noticing, so, Jetson Choki Gelson's text only covers Buddhist tenet systems. There are many other beautiful texts that cover non-Buddhist tenet systems. Some of them just cover the traditions that came from India, but then there are some that cover also other systems that came from China and other parts of Asia. Comparing different systems. And so because this text only covers the Buddhist systems, which is fine, that's what we're trying to study here, that's, good. But what I thought to do first is just pause for a moment. And I wanted to ask you all to contemplate something. And if you want to share, you can together here for a moment. But, they say influenced by tenets, right? That's the term that's often used. And the idea is that whatever tenets a being is influenced by influences them from lifetime to lifetime, Does that make sense? So it becomes part of our the imprints of our attachment to a certain tenet system have a profound influence on us in this life and even in future lives. So that's part of why getting tenets correct helps us in this life and in future lives. But what I wanted to ask you to contemplate for a moment before we get into Buddhist tenets is this question. In your own life, right? For example, growing up or as a young adult or whatever, so as a child, as a teenager, and then as a young adult, what tenet systems influenced you? Right? And to really contemplate that for a moment, right? Like, what are the tenet systems, and the people around me as I was growing up, were they uninfluenced by tenets or were they influenced by tenets? And in what way was I influenced by tenets? Right? And we don't usually think that. We don't say, oh, I was influenced by tenets, but actually, right, of course we were, right? Or many of us. I mean, some of us were uninfluenced by tenets, right? But that's also that's also an influence. Does that make sense? And because and if you think just in this, I was just thinking about this, like in this country, the world, it's a humongous number of tenet systems, right? But actually I was contemplating because of course, you could say, I was pausing because I was thinking like Christianity or Islam or Judaism, right? And as I thought about real people I know, that's none of those three religions is in and of itself a tenet system. Each of those religious traditions has many, many different tenet systems within them, don't they? Because I can think of Christians I've known, for example, who say, God created the earth in 7. Well, actually, I don't know, nobody I'm close to, but I've met people like that who think God created the earth in 7 days. Right? And there are others who say God is love and God created the universe, right? Something like that, right? Well, those are two different Christian tenets, right? Different versions, But actually, I was thinking about this. Well, you will be able to guess why, of course, given the context. But I was thinking about somebody I knew who said he was influenced by tenet. I remember talking once to a white supremacist, anti-Semitic, white power person. They hated Black people and Jews and people of any other group. He was influenced by tenets. He had thought about it, and he had come to the conclusion that was his belief. That was the purpose of life. That was the nature of existence. So that was a tenet system. He was an American person. So that's another example of an evil tenet system, right? Actually, certain kinds of science, right? At least the science that I grew up. I mean, science is different now than it was when I was growing up, in the sense that it keeps evolving. But certain kinds of I remember watching a dialogue at MIT when I was a young adult, where the Dalai Lama was talking with a group of physicists, and what he was and it helped by the Dalai Lama asking questions. I was like, he was pointing out that they believed in tenets. Like they said, like the physicist was saying, well, had this view that that there's no such thing, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of matter, right? And the Dalai Lama said, well, why do you believe that? And the person said, well, I can only see, matter. And Dalai said, well, what do you see it with? And so on, right? Of course, you have an experience of consciousness. But it became clear as I was listening, I was like, oh, well, he's pointing out that that particular physicist had a tenet system, a set of beliefs that he had come to through his own reflection, that had its own limitations, of course, and benefits. But anyway, so I guess I'm just getting at, like, there are many, many, many different kinds of tenet systems that we may have been influenced by. And we may have been, and we may have been influenced by people. We may have grown up around people also who are uninfluenced by tenets. But my question for you is just to pause for a moment and think about what were the tenets that I was influenced by before, not counting Buddhist tenets for the moment. My question is, does anybody want to share anything, your own reflections about that? You don't have to, but I just wanted to pause. I just think it's useful to then go into, well, now we're going to study Buddhist tenets, but what are the non-Buddhist tenets that you personally may have been influenced by? And if you don't think about it, it's useful for each of us to think about that. At least if you don't want to share it, think about it. But does anybody want to share any personal reflections on that? Ryan?
I'll share.
Yeah.
Always down to talk. I was raised Catholic, but not in like a really active way. I mean, my family is Irish Catholic. It just was. It's just the way you were. And so, but the tenet system, I think that, that we had was that there's certain things that Jesus likes and certain things he doesn't like. And you have to rack up the things he likes. And then when you die, and you had to do you had to go through your particular sacraments too, confession and communion and all that stuff. And if you do that stuff, and then you die, you get to go to heaven, and all this life is for is preparing for that, because this life is short. But it's very much like obviously an outsider tenet system. You're relying on the grace of some other being to get you there. And even though it wasn't like a particularly active system, it was almost like a social system, like the way you're raised. This is what you do because of this. And then when I finally didn't really care for that anymore, it was almost like a adverse, all things associated with that, I was, adverse to later on, until I got older. That's probably what attracted me to a Tibetan style Buddhism, is because there's a lot of like similarities to Catholic like iconography and structures and whatnot. I have a feeling that that's what attracted me to this particular era thing of Buddhism. So anyway, I thought about it a lot.
That's interesting. Thanks. Yeah, anybody else want to share anything? Good thing.
I think the basic tenets I grew up with, I was raised Catholic, but left that religion pretty quickly, when I went to college. But it was sort of being an outsider, because we were always sort of outside. I was raised in a sort of working class Italian community in a very wealthy community. So I was always in classes with all the wealthy kids, but I was an outsider to some extent. And I was an outsider when I went to college, and I was an outsider, and I represent outside people now, people that are discriminated against, or whistleblowers, people that are expelled from the norm. And I think that's sort of what drew me to Buddhism, because it has the sort of, we're all connected, we're all the same, we're all equal, but in a way that gets across the outsider insider kind of thing. In other words, it sort of breaks down that barrier, but in a way, how do I say this? In a way that acknowledges that exists, but breaks it down. which I think explains sort of what's going on now with these violent white supremacist people, that they're so far out there, and they're not connected. They're outsiders, but they're really outsiders. I mean, they're engaged in violent action against everybody else. So it's sort of people that sort of need Buddhism the most.
Yeah. Yeah, does anybody else want to share?
I can share, Dr. Lang. Oh, sorry. Was there someone?
Oh, go ahead. And then first you and then Sujata.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm also actually raised Catholic, although I don't know if this has to do with that faith. But I just for some reason I just have had this like sense of, if I have a set of principles which I seem to have set early on a few things, that I won't budge. So I'm very uncompromising with like a few things, which one of that is so about cheating, for example. So I'm very like, and a lot of, even when I was a kid in school, right, kids would do these little things about cheating. And I'm not able to do it. Like, I just was extremely uncomfortable, even though I don't know actually where that was coming from. So I don't know if that's like, did I set my mind and said, oh yeah, is this my tenet system? But at some point I did, like, when I started work, and I started as an auditor. I'm actually a CPA. And we have work, so we have professional ethics where we review books of companies, and we're supposed to have a set of things that we should be doing to make sure that we hold the company accountable, and that if we report that we're reporting that responsibly, right? There's a responsibility there. But I found when I was doing that work, I was starting to question why we're doing certain things. If we have this set of principles, how come we're doing this? So for example, we would adjust the accounting books, and then the partners would meet with the board of directors. And then after their meeting, they'll say, well, everything's okay. So I started to question, because I said, well, why is that okay? We found some problems in the way that things were booked. So I become very uncomfortable with those things. And then my boss at that time said, well, that's okay. We do that all the time. I'm like, well, that doesn't mean it's okay. So I find myself kind of always had that sense of like, just something uncomfortable rising up in me. And then I ended up leaving the job. So I ended up not being motivated in what I'm doing because of it. I don't know if that kind of, so I just wanted to share that. It's less about like, I don't know if it's coming from a set of morals or just that, I was calling it more like principles that I don't want to compromise. So I've set my mind that this is what's important to me, and I'm not gonna compromise it with kind of my day-to-day, if that makes sense. I just wanted to share that, because I wasn't sure if it was coming from an ethical standpoint more than that I set myself at some point to say, no, these are the things that are important to me for my sense of integrity and character, and I'm not gonna compromise on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, one general comment I'll make. First of all, thank you for sharing it. And one general comment I'll make that's worth just for everyone. Just using, I don't know, I can't say your personal example, of course. I don't know exactly, but it leads me to one general point, which is that's worth thinking about. I think for any of us, which is from a Buddhist perspective, from an insider perspective, one thing one would, in the example you were just giving, I think one thing that sometimes Buddhism would assert is, or differentiate is, in what cases are we influenced by a specific tenet that, that we contemplated in this life, or then sometimes we have an impulse, right? To, like, for example, to not lie or to not cheat. And that can be from a past life. In other words, from our, like, so you may have trained in honesty and trained in not lying in a past life. And then that would lead to a kind of natural discomfort, right? Whereas somebody else, you can see that, can't you? There are other people, I mean, if you look at young people, right? There's some people where it's just natural to want to lie. There are other people where it makes them uncomfortable. And sometimes you can attribute that to their parenting but they would actually, I remember as a kid, there was nobody I loved more than my grandfather. And we would go to the store and sometimes he would steal candy. And for me and my sister, and I hated it. It made me so uncomfortable. And I was like, the parenting would have been to like that, actually. He was my grandparent. He was the most respected person in my family. So I was like, sometimes I think about that as it's similar to the example you gave, I think, in the sense of, I was like, well, why would I feel uncomfortable? He was telling me it was fine. I was like, it must have been a past life imprint or something, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. And my point is just my point is that we all have also imprints from past lives. And I think the example you gave might be what's the word? Part of past life training. Possibly, of course, I don't know your past lives or my own either, but it's worth sometimes thinking about that sometimes we're influenced by tenets in this life based on a past life training we've done. And it's worth contemplating that, I think. Because sometimes we also have wrong approaches in this life that might be based on our negative things we did. In this case, it would be a positive. And then Sujata, you had something.
I really appreciate this question. Thank you so much for it. And it was particularly beneficial for me because I think that I feel that I have a lot of baggage from my past religious life. And so it was really good to see how many of the positive tenets come from my past religious life and from my parents, around whom I have also a lot of baggage, right? And other baggage that got a little unpacked today that was really beautiful to hear from so many Catholic folks, formerly Catholic folks. I married a formerly Catholic person who is also in this tradition now. And my people were colonized by the Portuguese and fully colonized. Sorry. So when people are in India, they're always like, let me get a break and go to Goa, get a break from India. And when people say that, it breaks my heart. I'm like, my people were so thoroughly colonized that there's nothing Indian left in us anymore, right? Except for those of us who fled 500 years earlier. And so that's my lineage, that we were colonized by the Portuguese, who were allowed to stay in India until 1961, actually. And so we weren't liberated with the rest of India. It's complicated. Anyway, and I ended up marrying into a Catholic family. It's very, very interesting. But with regard to tenets, I think from my mother, who was very devout Hindu, but also we come from this particular piece of Hinduism that left Goa, and Buddha reigns very large in this particular part of Hinduism. So the Buddha's all over our altar, and so karma was just huge. Like the notion of karma was huge, but in a very fearful way, right? And devotion to God was a huge part of this thing. And severe morality around sexuality, sort of from my mother. And then from my father, who was a very political person, socialist, anti-racist, anti-classist, but also super sexist, and had a completely opposite morality around sexuality that was, I think, maybe lacking in morality, but there were tenets to it. There were tenets about misbehavior. And so the conflict between the two of them was interesting to grow up with these two totally different sets of tenets around that. But what they shared was this real striving towards excellence. And I think also the way in which they both come from the exact same community. We're very inbred. And one of the things that's very, they're wedded to is this notion of searching. We originally were like these Jnanamarg people, so like intellectual analysis religiously, and that searching was a huge part of it. But yeah, so, but also assimilation and assimilating other things into our lives and being assimilated and being, so these are all different things there's so many, but it's just it's a thing to journal about later. Beautiful question. I super, super appreciate it.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Oh. I think one very general comment, which as long as the Dalai Lama has sort of said things like this, but it's just striking me again as true, is that, it's good for us to be aware, well, I mean, he didn't say this part, but it's good. I think it's good for us to be aware of the tenets we're influenced by, because they don't disappear, right? Like, in other words, we can choose based on, our own analysis, on our own deep process, to embrace, even within Buddhism, we can choose to embrace new tenets, right? And then, and so on. But whatever we were influenced by previously doesn't completely disappear, right? And so to be aware of that, and whether it's, well, I can appreciate iconography because I had iconography in the past or something, it doesn't have to be a negative thing, but if we're aware of it, then we're unconscious, or we're not aware of how it's influencing us. Whereas I think if we're aware of what our previous influences were, then we can notice how they're influencing our relationship to what we're doing now. So I just think I really do want to emphasize, I just think for everybody, it's really useful to be aware of, it's Dalai Lama often tells us that, what does he say? Like, he gives that example of the Tibetan woman who came to him and said, some Christians helped me, so I decided in this life I'm going to be Christian, but in my next life, I'll be Buddhist again. And of course he laughed and said, she was being so influenced by her Tibetan influences, right, that she wasn't recognizing even that she wasn't really being Christian. So anyway, I think we're all like that though, and so it's good to be aware of that, and to ask I guess the last thing I'll say about that topic is just what I would personally suggest is to every now and then come back to that and contemplate, when it seems relevant, to every now and then ask, well, now how might I be being influenced by my past tenet influences? Because my own experience with that is that there are a lot of ways I wasn't aware because it wasn't relevant at certain times in my life. And then as things change, as circumstances change, suddenly influences come up. And I think, what is this? And I'm like, oh, wow, it's a belief, I had as when I was a kid. And suddenly it's now influencing my perception of things and my way of relating to things. Because, and I'll think, oh, yeah, I'm Buddhist, but this reaction doesn't seem very, very Buddhist to me. I'll have to look, well, what's the belief system behind it? And then to say, well, what do I do with that now that I'm doing this in my life, and so on. So anyway, I think that can be very useful. And then let's see. Okay. So then we'll go back. We'll come to turn to the text for a moment. And I wanted to say a couple of general things. One is, so this text, Presentation of Tenets, is it says here by Jetsun Manjushri Choki Gyaltsen. And so, since we're going to use this text throughout this whole series of classes, I thought to say a couple brief things. First of all, Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen, right? I'll first of all say there were a couple different versions of his dates, but roughly he was born in 1464 and he died in 1544. So if you think about who he was, he studied, one of his first teachers as a child was the first Dalai Lama, right? Who was a student of Jetsun Tsongkhapa, right? So you can get a sense of what generation he was in. Does that make sense? So it was Tsongkhapa's time, there were Tsongkhapa's direct students, and most of Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen's students would have been like students, like if you think of students of Tsongkhapa, right? So he was from that time period roughly. It's interesting, like, he's usually associated with Sarah J monastery. He was abbot of Sarah monastery, and so, but actually I was sort of reading his biography, what we have of his biography, and as a young person, he studied at Tashi Linpo, which was founded by the first Dalai Lama. So the first Dalai Lama was a student of Tsongkhapa. He founded Tashi Linpo Monastery, which would later, not yet, but in later times would become associated with the Panchen Lamas. And so Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's early education was at Tashi Linpo, where he studied the 5 great treatises and so on. And then he went to Sarah to continue his studies. And when he was at Sarah, he was a great scholar. And so he eventually became the 12th abbot of Sarah Monastery. And he left Sarah and went off and became abbot. He was abbot of a few different monasteries, but the largest and most significant was Sarah. And the only other thing, I don't want to give a lot about him, but the other thing I think that's good to be aware of, or sort of in the context of our studies, is he wrote many books. He was a prolific author, and there's a whole in Tibetan, I guess, there are many different genres of literature, and one genre of literature, what in Tibetan are called gikcha, which are like textbooks, like monastic textbooks. And if you think about it this way, like there are these great, if you read Tibetan Buddhist Tibetan text and translation, right, there are these wonderful, huge commentaries and explanations and so on. But then as part of like monastic, in the monasteries, in the great scholarly monasteries, as part of the study programs, every monastery has its own textbooks, right, which are like, on all the major subjects, they have to have sort of their monastery's set of textbooks. And in general, in the Gelugpa tradition, which we're studying from that perspective, there was a whole kind of history and politics around who would be the, which each monastic university, which scholar would they accept this textbooks of, right? And it had to be usually somebody associated with their monastery in some way and who they respected very much. So anyway, Sarah J Monastery uses the textbooks of Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen. And I was like, oh, that's why we're studying Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's text, because FPMT, it was founded by Lama Tupten Yeshe and Lama Tupten Zopa Rinpoche, and they're both associated with Sarah J. So I don't think it's a coincidence that, FPMT has an emphasis on some texts from Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen, because that's the, the lineage comes through that. I was sort of comparing, because I was looking at some other, there are many. One thing I will say is this is a genre, I think largely thanks to Jeffrey Hopkins, in large part, the genre not the genre, sorry, the topic of tenets. There are many translations, many good translations of books on tenets, because of the kindness of Geshe Lundrup Sopa, who's passed away. But he translated Geshe Sopa, who was one of the teachers of my teacher. He was one of my teachers, but he was also one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers. Anyway, he has 2 wonderful translations of books on tenets. And then Jeffrey Hopkins and his students did humongous numbers. And this is, I'll just show, actually, this is Maps of the Profound, Jamyang Shepa's great exposition of Buddhist and non-Buddhist tenets. That's his book, very big. And that's Jeffrey Hopkins. And he's done many others, and his students did many books. So anyway, there are many translations into English on tenets. But we're going to use Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen's brief text. And I think, part of the benefit of it is it's brief. And so, it doesn't, and it only covers the Buddhist tenet systems also. So that's Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen. And then looking at the text, he starts, as Tibetan texts usually start, with an homage, right? And he says, I pay homage to the eminent holy beings who are in essence inseparable from Guru, Protector, Manjushri. So one point is, Manjushri is the, some say Bodhisattva, some say Buddha of wisdom. So we're embarking on a project of studying tenets, which requires wisdom. So homage to Manjushri is quite appropriate in that context. And then he says also Guru, Protector, right? So in that sense, right, we're paying homage, there's the, what we say, Tsongkhapa says, right, the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable Guru, right? So we're paying homage to our Guru, who is the source, right, of our knowledge of Buddhism, ultimately, right, and is the foundation of all good qualities and so on. So Chökyi Gyaltsen pays homage to his own gurus who taught him about tenets, right, because that's where the lineage came from to him, and so in a sense we're paying homage also in beginning to study it. Like he includes it there partly out of his own expression of homage, but also for us recognizing that this comes in a lineage from the Buddha down through great teachers to us. And then he says there, as Tibetan texts usually do, right, there are outlines and sub-outlines and sub-outlines. Tibetan texts are quite good at that. And so he gives a very general outline. He says, here in explaining the presentation of tenets, there are three major divisions of outline. 1, the definition, 2, the divisions, and 3, the meaning of each division. And then he says something, which we have time, good. So I want to go into, so now he says the definition, and I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. He says, the definition of a person who profounds Buddhist tenets is a person propounding tenets who accepts the 3 jewels to be the final objects of refuge and who does not assert any objects of refuge other than them. Right? So that's interesting, right? He's saying a person who profounds Buddhist tenets is somebody who accepts the 3 jewels as their final object of refuge. I was sort of contemplating that definition, and I want to kind of, it's an interesting definition, I think. Like, right? So it's a person who accepts the 3 jewels, right? Which means they took refuge in the 3 jewels, right? And in the monastery, I didn't study it this way. I didn't study tenets this way, but in the monastery they would debate. So they, part of definitions is for debate. And so I actually want to ask you guys a question, just to contemplate. The definition, right, of a person who, so he's not defining tenets actually, he's defining a person who profounds Buddhist tenets, right? And he says, the person propounding tenets, again, is somebody who accepts the 3 jewels as final object of refuge. So what I would ask you to contemplate, I'm just started debating his own definition to some extent, but for sure, I've come across people who are Buddhist, right, who say, I accept the 3 jewels as my object of refuge. But then their tenets, sometimes you come across people like this, right? Whose tenets, though, are, from a Buddhist perspective, wrong. Right? So my question for you is, I'm just sort of debating here for a second, right? He says, the person who accepts the 3 jewels as the object of refuge is the person who propounds Buddhist tenets, right? But I'm just asking a question, like, what happens then if somebody says, yes, I'm Buddhist, I accept the 3 jewels as my object of refuge, and then they're confused, right? And so they say, so I'm propounding Buddhist tenets, and they say, and the Buddhist tenet is, and they go on to say something that's totally incorrect, right? From a Buddhist perspective. I'll just ask you then, are they a person who propounds Buddhist tenets or not? And I'm not sure what Chökyi Gyaltsen's answer to that would be. He was a great debater and a great scholar, so I don't know what, and none of the commentaries I read raised this question. I just was, this is my own question, based on his definition, right? And for sure, there are many Buddhist authors and Buddhist speakers, who said they were propounding Buddhist tenets, but what they propounded was incorrect. it doesn't say correct Buddhist tenets. That's right. Well, I think that's an important distinction. One commentary, so, that's a question I'm raising just to think about. Then I'll say another point, though, that one commentary said in relation, that does kind of relate to that point. And well, actually, Ryan, do you have something you want to say?
No, I was just gonna talk about that question.
Oh, go ahead. You can.
But we don't have, I was gonna say, I guess, until one attains enlightenment, until one becomes a Buddha, at some point your understanding of Buddhist tenets is incorrect anyway, right? And so that doesn't make you not a Buddhist, as long as, I guess, you cross the threshold of, going for refuge to the three jewels. Once you do that, then, you're at least on your journey of gradually understanding things better and better until you do become a Buddha. But, something the tenets you might, well, I guess we're going to learn about what tenets really are anyway, but your understanding of Buddhist philosophy will be at least subtly incorrect until you attain Buddhahood, right? So
it's an interesting question. Certainly our understanding becomes better and better as we progress. That's true. That's an interesting question. I don't know, actually. One thing I'll say is, essentially I was thinking of some texts by Tsongkhapa himself, by Lama Tsongkhapa, where he sort of takes, he'll he quotes some Buddhist teachers, but he's very, if you read Tsongkhapa, he's very, first of all, he's very gracious person as compared to his student, Khedrubje. If you read Khedrubje's, actually it's interesting, if you read Khedrubje's texts, who was one of the two main disciples of Tsongkhapa, Khedrubje, basically, his tone oftentimes is like, so-and-so says, this, and, his tone is basically, and they're a complete idiot. And how could anybody be so stupid as to say that that is a Buddhist view, he kind of, it's hard to imagine the level of stupidity that a person could have to assert that while, saying they're a follower of Nagarjuna. And, it makes scholars nauseous, that's kind of his tone. Whereas Tsongkhapa is much more gracious. He'll sort of say his tone is much more like, some wonderful scholars say this, but if you carefully analyze, the teaching of so-and-so, then you can see that, the correct understanding is like this or something. He's much more gentle. He's still pointing out incorrect points in other scholars, but he does it more graciously than his student. So it's interesting, and anyway, that doesn't mean they weren't Buddhist. And so Tsongkhapa, none of them would say they weren't Buddhist. So I agree with Ryan in that sense, but it's just interesting to think about, is one point. And then another point about this line, right, that actually the abbot of, I always look at different commentaries before classes and so on, and the abbot of Kopan monastery, whose name is Ken Rinpoche Geshe Chone, Geshe Tupten Chone. He makes an interesting point on this in reference. He's the only person who really goes into detail on the definition here. And one thing he says is, he says, well, when it says the person who propounds Buddhist tenets is someone who accepts the three jewels as the final object of refuge. He says, well, does that imply they understand what the three jewels are? And then he says it should, that if you're really propounding Buddhist tenets, you should understand, so if somebody says, I take refuge in the three jewels, but they don't understand what the three jewels are, then are they really propounding Buddhist tenets? That's the question he raises, which kind of is addressing my question, but in a different way. But then again, as Ryan said, I think it's true, right? There are many, many, many different levels of understanding of what the three jewels are, aren't there? I sometimes think, I've sat so many times actually with different lamas, but especially with Kyumbe Khyentse Rinpoche, so many times when he gave refuge, and he always goes over what are the three jewels. Some of you have been there, I know, at times when he's given refuge. And he always goes over that, right? If you're taking refuge in three jewels, he always explains what are the three jewels. But of course, the way he's explaining it there is not as much detail as if you've heard him even teach chapter 1 of the Uttara Tantra, right? The Sublime Continuum or whatever. That goes into a lot more detail about the nature of the three jewels, humongously more detail, right? Different definitions of what the three jewels are and so on. There's the resultant three jewels, and there's the causal three jewels, and there's the, so I guess my point is like, anyway, so the person should have some level of understanding of what the three jewels are. And then if they're expounding tenets, then that would be Buddhist tenets. But yeah, so there, and I guess, yeah, anyway, so it depends on our understanding of what the three jewels are, though. And then the next, so that's his general definition of the person who propounds Buddhist tenets. Then he says the divisions, right? Second outline, divisions. And he says there are 4 divisions of proponents of Buddhist tenets. And then he lists them, right? 1, proponents of the Great Exposition, in Sanskrit, Vaibhashikas, or Vaibhashika. 2, proponents of sutras, Sautantrika. 3, proponents of the mind-only school, Chittamatra. And 4, proponents of the middle way, or Madhyamaka school. The first 2 are schools that profound truly established external objects. That's what he says. So now I wanted to say, this is like his orientation, right? And to say some things about that. And to say some things about, actually, I want to say first, I wanted to actually quote the Lankavatara Sutra. So, sutra is a teaching by the Buddha, historical Buddha. So the Buddha said, and this is a quote from the Buddha from the Lankavatara Sutra. He said, "My doctrine has 2 modes, advice and tenets. To children, I speak of advice, and to yogis, tenets." So again, just point out, like, sometimes we can, I think sometimes, I don't know where that comes from. Sometimes some people really like kind of almost relate to tenets as if they're just like, I don't know what the word is, like, not related to yogic practice, let's say, not related to enlightenment. But the Buddha said to children, he gave, so what does he mean, right? I think what the Buddha is getting at is that to childish beings who aren't really, like, who aren't ready, right, who aren't serious, he gives some simple advice, But to people who really want to practice meditation, he teaches tenets, right? People who really want to achieve the result, he teaches tenets. And then these 4 different divisions, he calls them here, divisions of Buddhist tenets, right? The Tibetan tradition would say they're all taught by the Buddha. Does that make sense? So these are none of these, right? These are Buddhist tenets in the sense that they were all taught by the Buddha and taught by great Buddhist masters. That's the first thing. And, passed down by great Buddhist masters. And each of them, has its own traditions. They're all Buddhist, but they're like actual practitioners, who upheld these traditions. And then I want to say also, people sometimes have this misunderstanding, so I want to be clear about this, that the Tibetan tradition is a tradition that upholds all 4. In the Tibetan tradition, we often say, oh, well, we're followers of the middle way school, right? The Madhyamaka school, because all the Tibetan lineages hold that the Madhyamaka is the ultimate. For the most part, they all say that. Some 100%, but most Tibetans say middle way school, the Madhyamaka is the ultimate expression of the Buddha's intent. But the Tibetan tradition in general is an upholder of all 4 of these tenets. They teach all 4. They practice all 4. They teach the texts that propound all 4. And, and they spend, and actually, if you look in the great Gelugpa monasteries, they spend years and years studying texts from each of these different traditions. So it's not like they only study Madhyamaka texts, right? When they do the Vinaya, it's from their Vinaya tradition is from the Vaibhashika. They spend a long time studying Vinaya. They study what's it called, Abhidharma texts from both the Sautantrika and the Chittamatra perspectives, and so on. So they study all these traditions, they uphold all these traditions, and actually I'll just share this. Like, it was interesting. I had a conversation once with a friend, Geshe Darge, who lives up in Connecticut, who's a good friend, and he was telling me, I thought it was very sweet. Cool in a way of him. Like, he went at one point, I can't remember which country, he went to one of the Pali, one of the countries where the Pali tradition is practiced. I think it might have been Thailand. I'm not sure where he went now, I forgot. And he stayed for months with a group of monks, or a long time, like a month maybe or something. And he was like, well, I think they study this tradition. So he wanted to go and talk to them about it. And he went and kind of had conversations about their studies. And then he realized that, like, that he had studied their tradition more than they had, in terms of the actual tenets of it, because he was but he enjoyed talking to them and kind of learning from them what they had studied. So that's that point. And then, so then in terms of why study these four, right? And I want to say, I think there are two reasons. There are probably more than two, but I want to share two reasons. One is there are times in our own practice where it's most useful to come at our practice from any of these given traditions, if that makes sense. They all have a purpose in terms of practice. And, and it's a mistake, actually. If you think like, oh, well, the Madhyamaka is the highest, so I'm only Madhyamaka or something, like I'm only gonna, one point is there are times in our practice where, although that doctrine is the highest, we're not the highest, if that makes sense. And there are times I know for myself where, like, I shall say that, like, there are times where it's wonderful to meditate on emptiness from a Madhyamaka perspective, right? But there are other times where you're too upset, or you're too agitated, or your mind is too gross. And if you try to do that, it won't work, right? So you need to then maybe apply a different school's perspective in order to help yourself. Does that make sense, kind of?
Excuse me, Lauren?
Yeah.
Are these considered to be an evolution or simultaneously truth?
That's the next question. It's a good question. That's the next point I was going to make. So one is, for us as individuals, there may be different times to practice from a different perspective. But the other is from Jetsun Chogi Gelsen's perspective and from Tsongkhapa's perspective, these were all taught by the Buddha. They're all Buddhist, valid Buddhist traditions upheld by great Buddhist masters, but they're presented in order, 1 through 4, from least subtle to most subtle. And so the Vaibhashikas would be considered the least subtle, the grossest presentation, and so on. And then it gets more and more precise or more subtle. And so part of the reason that the tenets is studied also is that ultimately we want to understand, right, the most subtle view, which is the Madhyamaka. And part of the idea is that they sometimes say they're like stairs, or like, stairs, let's call it, or rungs on a ladder or something like that. And that if you try to jump to the top of the stairs, you may fall and hurt yourself. And so it's better to go step by step. So they present these 4 in a kind of sequential order, in the sense that if you can understand the Vaibhashika well, it will help you to better understand the Sautantrika. If you understand the Sautantrika well, it'll help you understand the Chittamatra. If you understand Chittamatra well, it'll help you understand the Madhyamaka. And that if you want to correctly understand the Madhyamaka, then it would be very, very beneficial to have first studied, to have studied these other schools, views, first, in a way. And I want to say a personal reflection on that point, because why I really agree with it is, you know, I guess, I don't know, because of, probably, because of the times of my own study, when I began studying Tibetan Buddhism, I didn't do that. There was the first things I studied were Madhyamaka. When I used to go to, like when I was young and went to Buddhist teachings, all the teachings, early on in my studies, all the teachings were from Madhyamaka perspective. And I thought, well, actually, being kind of arrogant, I thought, well, great, I'm studying the highest. That must be really good. And then I thought, oh, let me also study highest Yoga Tantra. I'll study Madhyamaka and highest Yoga Tantra. That I'm really high up or something, because I was too ignorant to understand that as Tsongkhapa says about highest Yoga Tantra, if you haven't studied the lower tantras, then saying that highest Yoga Tantra is the highest is just an expression of your foolishness. Like, what does it mean that it's highest Yoga Tantra? You don't even know what that means if you didn't understand the other tantras. That didn't occur to me. And the same with Madhyamaka, right? Like, just think, oh, I'm studying the most subtle of all the schools in Madhyamaka, right? Like, it must be the best. And then years later, when I was reading texts, particularly like on the mind-only school and on the Satantrika school, and I realized I couldn't tell the difference. Like, I would read a few lines from a text by a Satantrika scholar, and I would think, well, that seems like he's saying what Madhyamakas say. And then I thought, oh wow, that means I don't understand what Madhyamakas are saying, of course. And if you read the subtle presentations of some of the great, right? Like, think about the mind-only school, right? The great masters of the mind-only school include Vasubandhu and Asanga, right? Who was a fourth Bhumi Bodhisattva, right? Who expounded said to be a fourth Bhumi Bodhisattva who expounded the mind-only school. Incredibly subtle philosophy, right? And my point is like, if you can't understand the difference between those, then you don't understand the unique features of the Madhyamaka, right? There's no way. And so actually, it's only when we can understand these other schools and then understand what is different, how the Prasangika Madhyamaka view is different from their view, only then can you say you understand the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So it's very useful to view these as, to answer Jeff's question, as kind of sequential steps for ourselves in our study and contemplation and practice. Yeah, so that's very useful. And actually, one other point I'll make is if you study any of the great treatises on Madhyamaka, by Chandrakirti or by Tsongkhapa, for example, they make reference to these other schools. Does that make sense? Even Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the chapter on the view, Tsongkhapa's great exposition of Lamrim's chapter, the middle length Lamrim, all the great texts by those great masters refer to the teachings of these other schools. So if you don't know about those other doctrines, then when you read those texts, you won't really understand them, right? Because you won't know what they're differentiating from. Does that make sense? So, so in that sense, anyway, to answer Jeff's question, though, they're like sequential steps. And so there's a great benefit in studying these other points and to doing them in this order, so that then and hopefully this series of classes will help us do that. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yes, but they're considered to all be equally true in the sense of the accuracy of the presentation in those four schools is a truth, but it's not the final truth.
Oh, I see. To answer that question, like if you think of that's an interesting distinction. Okay, that's that question. Let's say this the right way. If you think about this, if you go to the next, like if you think of each of the higher schools, right? If you call them higher, more subtle schools, whatever, they accept certain points from the lower schools and refute others. So they would say there are certain things that a lower school teaches that are correct, and they would say there are other things that the lower school teaches that are incorrect. And so, like and I'll give, I don't want to, maybe I shouldn't do this, but I'll do it very briefly as an example. Like the Vaibhashikas assert that they're partless moments, that there is moments that are partless of time. The mind-only school scholars would say that's incorrect. There's no such thing as a partless moment. And Madhyamikas would say there's no such thing as a partless. Madhyamikas for sure would say there's no such thing as a partless anything. So the higher schools accept some points of the lower schools and reject others. So they would say it's not entirely accurate, if that makes sense. And actually, it's interesting. Each of the schools would say, if you think of it this way, actually, another way of putting it, which is kind of intriguing, is every one of those four schools would say that the other three are inaccurate on certain points. So they would say every one of those four schools would say the other schools are accurate in some areas and inaccurate in others. So actually, you can't. It's interesting. You can't ultimately accept that all four are completely valid, because if you accept one, you have to reject certain tenets of the other.
But those are also considered to be true under certain circumstances or from a certain perspective, right? I mean, that's what you were saying. That's what you were saying before. The presentation of the tenets of the Vaibhashika school are valid from that perspective, and only when that perspective evolves are they no longer valid. I mean, that's basically the point, I think.
I guess actually what I would say is that they're beneficial, that they're internally consistent. A few points. One is I'd say they're internally consistent from that perspective, and they're functional. They're useful for a person's spiritual development, who's practicing in that way. But then if you look at, like, say, Chandrakirti, from Chandrakirti's perspective, he would say, but they're not valid, actually. He would say they weren't, there is a, so it's interesting, it's like subtle distinction or something, but they're internally consistent and they're useful. But, from Chandrakirti's perspective, he would say, but they're not, like the cognition of a partless particle is not a valid cognition, he would say.
It kind of reminds me of, I think it's in the Diamond Sutra, where the Buddha uses a metaphor about using a raft to cross a river, but when you're done using that raft, you don't hang on to it, discard it, because you don't need it anymore. So like, I guess like kind of learning about like, to my mind, like the idea of like a partless moment is like clearly incorrect, but for some folks learning at certain stages in their development, that might be a really useful raft for them at that time.
Yep.
That's just what it made me think of when you talked about it like that in the different schools.
Yeah, no, I think that's a useful way to view it. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so I guess it's useful to think of it. So again, they're internally consistent, they're useful for one's spiritual development. But it's interesting, yeah, because I'll say that, part of how Prasangika Madhyamikas define valid cognition, though, is it means that a subsequent cognition cannot show you it was invalid, otherwise it wasn't really valid. So in that sense, if you can subsequently see that you were wrong, then it wasn't truly valid, right? So it wasn't a valid cognition, but it was a, yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Also that not all, I make that point also, I think it's a useful thing just to reflect. I was just sharing a personal reflection now, and I think it's quite useful also, which is that, let's say this right, like for ourselves or for others, like part of what the Buddha's, they say upaya, right? The Buddha's skillful means, right? Part of the Buddha's skillful means was recognizing what would help a given person at a given time, right? And, and if something was true but not helpful, he didn't teach the person that, right? If it wouldn't help that person, even if it was true, he didn't share it with them. He knew that it was true, but he only shared what would be useful to the person at that time. One harder thing, I think, I'll just share, this is my own reflection, but if you're in the presence of a Buddha, then you have the Buddha to kind of do that for you. You know, this kind of, I would imagine, would be a relief. You know, for ourselves, when we're actually practicing, of course, we have the responsibility of doing it for ourselves, which is harder, right? To know what teaching to apply at what time, it's harder work because we have to discern that for ourselves. What teaching should I apply now? What teaching should I apply now? And I'll share one other point. Like, I sometimes share little things like this when I'm teaching on these kind of topics, but I'll just share this reflect. I'll use actually my closest friend is a friend who lives in California. He's a practicer in the Kagyu tradition. And one thing I totally love about it, part of the reason we're such good friends, one thing I totally love about it is he practices Mahamudra a lot. And sometimes he said to me one day, you know, he said, my guru says Madhyamaka is, of course, the highest view, and I know that's true. And he said, but for me, right now in my practice, if I take the mind only view, I do better in my actual sitting. And he said, so I'm going to practice mind only. It's cool. You know, it's Chittamatra. He said, that's my view for now. And he says, and if somebody later convinces me that, you know, on a practice level, Madhyamaka is better, then fine. You know, and I was like, I so appreciate that, you know, like his authenticity about practice and checking his own experience, right? And he was realizing when he was trying to meditate on the nature of his own mind, if he came at it from the tenet system of a mind-only school, he was able to abide better in his own practice. And for him at that stage, that was more useful. I thought, what a beautiful, introspective, honest practice, you know, that is helping his own practice. And then he's practicing better and he's actually doing the practice, you know. And I was like, and I thought, wow, like, or I was like, I don't know if I would, it made me actually ask, well, would I be honest with myself? Or would I say, oh no, I'm a Madhyamaka, you know, so I, you know, whatever. Like, so I think there's a real use in asking those questions at any given stage for us as people, you know, what's going to help me right now the most in my own practice. So, yeah. So those are like sequential, we study them in that order for a reason, right? From subtler to grosser to subtler, and to help our practice. I realized I skipped over something that I want to go back to just to share it, because I think it's also useful. And yeah, we have time for this too. You know, in terms of Buddhist tenets, right? Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen defines the person who profounds Buddhist tenets, as we went over, right? The person who took refuge in the 3 jewels. I just wanted to point out some other texts, and also when His Holiness the Dalai Lama comments on tenets, he often brings this up, and some other texts like the ones I mentioned that were translated by other translators, also add something that Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen doesn't mention. And I just thought to mention it because it's in some of the commentaries. And that is that another way of defining Buddhist tenets is a system of tenets that accepts the 4 seals. Right? And you could say that a person who is expounding Buddhist tenets is a person who takes refuge in the 3 jewels as the final object of refuge and accepts the 4 seals. So it's another way of defining what are Buddhist tenets, or they say all Buddhist tenet systems must accept the 4 seals. And the 4 seals were taught by Shakyamuni Buddha soon before his death. So the historical Buddha himself taught it. And those 4, I just want to mention them, are, one is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. All compounded phenomena. What is compounded, right? Compounded means arisen due to causes and conditions, you know, and having, it can also include having parts. Right? So all compounded phenomena, all things that arise due to causes and conditions are by nature impermanent. And remember, impermanent in this context means change moment. In Buddhism, impermanent means change moment by moment. Right? They doesn't abide for a second instant without changing. That's the definition of impermanent. And then the second of the 4 seals is all contaminated phenomena are suffering, or dissatisfactory, or suffering. And contaminated in this sense means in some way related to the mental afflictions, right? So contaminated doesn't mean has physical dirt on it, right? It means are connected to the mental afflictions. Right? So any phenomena that's connected to the mental afflictions is in the nature of dukkha, right? Suffering in that sense. Right? And we can go into the 3 types of suffering even, right? But it's connected to the suffering. Then the third of the 4 seals is all phenomena are selfless. Some translations say empty and selfless. I think if we're going to say they apply to all of the 4 Buddhist tenet systems, my own position, you can debate it, but is that probably better to say selfless, because all the Buddhist tenet systems accept anatman, right? Selflessness in that sense. So all phenomena are without atman, without self in that sense. And then the 4th of the 4 seals is nirvana, is peace. And so that's an interesting, Jetsun Shogi Gyaltsen doesn't go into that, but many of the other texts do, and His Holiness does when he presents this. And I think that's worth thinking about, right? So that those 4 essential seals, right? Those 4 points, those 4 essential teachings are common to all Buddhist schools. So whether, so when we meet, if you interact with Buddhists of different traditions, you can kind of check, right? And all the Buddhist traditions accept, right, impermanence, accept the nature of suffering, right? And the 4 Noble Truths actually are common to all the Buddhist schools. But and one point I would make is this idea also, nirvana is peace, right? Whereas that implies, it's a radical implication, isn't it? Right, that one. It implies that it's possible to be free from suffering. And I mentioned so anyway, that one implies that, right? Which is an incredible assertion, isn't it? That it's possible to be free from, right? And the 3rd and the 4th are connected, aren't, the second, they're all connected, but, but that all contaminated phenomena are suffering, right? Means, but then the 4th one means it's possible for there to be uncontaminated phenomena, right? Of contaminant that's not related to the mental afflictions. And therefore, peace means free, peace means free of suffering in this sense, right? It's interesting. In general, that's what that means. From a Madhyamaka Prasangika perspective, you could also say peace means empty, emptiness, but not all schools would accept that, right? So actually, even the 4 schools, they would actually define these slightly differently, wouldn't they? Those 4 different tenet systems would look at what do these 4 seals mean in slightly different ways, but they would all accept them. And so I just want to say, so as we go through these, and actually, I just want to say that too, you can actually contemplate it, right? So those 4 seals, right? One is to know those are the essential sort of points that all Buddhist teachings agree upon. And then another point, though, is that, it's interesting, isn't it? When you interact with Buddhists of different lineages and different cultures and different traditions, that we all have that in common, these fundamental beliefs, right? Which is nice to know, nice to relate to.
Dr. Lauren, quick clarification. You said it's common to all Buddhist schools. You mean just the 4 or including Hinayana?
That includes, so that would include, that would include all Buddhists and all the, all Buddhists on the planet, agree on those 4.
Thanks.
Those 4 points. Yeah.
Lauren, could I ask one more question?
Sure, of course.
So I'm curious about under the heading 1 definition and the word propounds. I was thinking about this actually when you were first going through, and I thought, I thought a Buddhist was someone who accepts the 4 seals. And I'm thinking about the word propounds. Buddhist tenets versus being a Buddhist, like the propounding versus being.
Yeah.
And I don't think my question goes beyond that, but I think that I was just noticing, what does it mean to be someone who propounds versus someone who holds a belief or operates within a belief or just is a Buddhist. Was something I was getting a little stuck on, and maybe seeing that there might be a difference there, to be a propounder, as it's explained in the definition here, versus being a Buddhist.
Yeah, I think it is two different things for sure. I agree with you. Like, because part of what let's say right, like, actually, if you, it's an point, like if you think of like, I'll just sort of contemplate, like if I think of most Tibetans I know, who are not, especially non-monks, right, like who are not monks, actually they don't propound, most, I mean some do, but most Tibetans who are not monks who I know don't propound any tenets. They would say they're Buddhist, they would say they practice whatever they practice, right? But they wouldn't be going, or they wouldn't be like saying that they're propounding anything in particular, would they? Sort of contemplating that.
But if pressed, they would say such and such and such and such.
Yeah, that's right. That's an interesting point. Yeah, I didn't really contemplate that too deeply, but person who propound is a person propounding tenets, right? So propounding actually means speaking, doesn't it? So if you're, yeah, that's interesting. Or writing, I suppose, right? In word, propounding implies with words. It doesn't say who believes in, right? Or who ascribes to.
No, I think exactly the opposite. I think it means the belief system. That's what it's talking about, right? So a person who believes such and such, I don't see any difference between a propounder. Some people don't talk, some people talk, but if pressed, people would say this and this and this as their truths.
Dictionary says it just means to put forth an idea. It doesn't necessarily mean it's putting forth a belief.
It says to put forth an idea, theory, or view for consideration by others. So it does imply a kind of expression. That's why I was double checking to make sure.
Yeah, but we were talking, not to bring up white supremacists again, but would somebody who's a mute, who doesn't communicate but is a white supremacist, would they be a propounder of white supremacism?
Yeah.
I think they probably would be, even though they don't communicate. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I one is that none of the commentaries really address that word very deeply. They more address the other points I mentioned. Who propounds Buddhist tenets? That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the English word implies some kind of expression. So if you were sitting in silent meditation, you're not propounding, right? Because it's implying to put forward an idea, theory, or point of view for consideration by others, right? That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you make me just kind of, because the way I kind of took it, at least, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like usually, that's interesting. I'm trying to think about Jetson Chogi Gelson, what he would mean by that versus how I would take it, which of course I don't know because I didn't know him a long time ago. But it's interesting in his world, right? If you contemplate what he probably means, right? He's talking about people who have spoken or written texts, isn't he? If you think about Jetson Chogi Gelson, he's talking about what he's talking about is like, if you think about him, right, in his worldview, he's talking about like, well, Kamala Shila said this and so said that, whereas, if he's saying like, but this philosopher from this, from ancient India did not accept the three jewels as the final object of refuge. And they were propounding tenets. So if you think about his world, he's kind of talking about, what he's really talking about are like, he would be looking at people from non-Buddhist traditions of India, non-Buddhist traditions of East Asia, possibly, and saying, they propound worldviews that are not, or beliefs or theories or ideas that are not. That's really what he's getting at, isn't it? Is that are, but they do not accept the three jewels as the final object of refuge. Whether it's an ancient non-Buddhist Indian philosopher, or he didn't write about it, but others did. If you talk about Confucius or something, right? Some Tibetan authors talk about authors like Confucius, right? So that'd be an example of somebody who does not accept the three jewels as a final object of refuge, but is expounding on tenets. Whereas he's really getting at, I think, like, whether it's, he would accept, for example, if a Theravadan monk in Thailand wrote a text, well, they accept the three jewels, so that's Buddhist tenets. I think that's what he's kind of getting at, would be my impression, isn't it? That's interesting. That's the way, if I contemplate his, what Tibetans would usually mean by that, I think that's what they would mean, but I'm not certain. Jody has it.
I hear everything that you were just saying about trying to think about back then. I also think of it as like, if called upon, I will say I'm a practicing Buddhist. Like, I haven't achieved. I try to follow these tenets and understand them, but I'm not there yet. So,
So would you say you propound them or you don't?
Well, in that definition of propound, it said about putting them forth, something about acceptance. So maybe like I accept them. I lost my definition. Putting forward or offering for consideration, acceptance, or adoption, set forth or propose. So like I kind of propose to be a good Buddhist, but I'm not a bodhisattva yet. I still do selfish things and so on. So I don't know, maybe could mean something like that.
So would you say you do or don't propound then?
I would say I propound, I just haven't accomplished.
Or your first question to the group was, describe your tenets. It had nothing to do with propounding. It had nothing to do with publicizing what you believe. It's the basis of your belief system. So I go back to, I don't think this depends on propounding. It depends on the basis of what you think to be true.
Oh, I see. I think now, Jeff, I understand better now what you're getting at. I think then we have to differentiate between two different things, actually. So it's good that's clarifying. Between, because actually it's interesting, as I said earlier, like Jetsun Chogi Yeltsin, his definition is of a preferred person who propounds Buddhist tenets, right? And I think we have to differentiate also between the tenets themselves, or holding to tenets, and then propounding them. Those are two different things for sure, right? In other words, so like a person could certainly ascribe to Buddhist tenets, right, without propounding them, and often that happens, in other words, and so yeah, so I think that's important, right? So we can ascribe to Buddhist tenets, or we could hold to Buddhist tenets. We could be trying to practice Buddhist tenets, and this overall, I think it's important to distinguish this. What we're studying is what are Buddhist tenets that we could then ascribe to, or we could then try to practice, or we could then try to internalize and make our worldview. And I do think this is an important distinction, so that's what we're trying to, that's what our main subject of study is, right? And I'm not, to be honest, it's interesting. I sort of have a question. Why does he define not what are Buddhist tenets, but what are a person who propounds Buddhist tenets, right? That's his definition. So I personally, my own personal stance on that would be that, first of all, our main subject of our main subject of study is jukta, tenets, right? Which are established convictions. And the process of establishing those is our reasoning, right? Is reasoning and coming to a conclusion, right? So in other words, so when we say an established conclusion, it means that we engage with a possible belief system and we come to our own conclusion. And that internal process is what's most important, in my view. You know, what he's getting at in this definition is actually a different point, really, which is, what does it mean to propound a tenet? And given that we're about to go into the four different Indian, schools that come from India of Buddhist philosophy, part of what I think, I'm actually looking through. Yeah, I think part of what is useful to talk about is, in this context, I think the most useful way to view it, really, to be honest, is that the propounders of those views are the people who presented them. I don't think it's actually useful to really approach this even, for example, I'm teaching this class. I don't think, technically I'm propounding a Buddhist tenet if I'm talking about it, right? But I actually think really in a more useful way, I think the most useful way for us to view it personally is that we're studying Buddhist tenets and we're trying to come to our own established conclusions through reasoning and coming to a cognition about them. And that I think the most useful way to view it is that, like, so for example, let's say the Vaibhashika, I just want to give an example of the Vaibhashikas and then we should stop. But with the Vaibhashikas, I personally think what's useful is to think of Vasumitra's Mahavibhasa. There is that Vasumitra was an expounder of the Vaibhashika view. He's a historical person who did teach on that view, wrote a text on it. I think that's a more useful way to view this, is that he's the expounder of that view and that we're now considering that view, as if that makes sense. And a Sangha is an expounder of the Chinamatran view, and we're considering that view and trying to understand it. So I personally, I think just for for the sake of our studies, I think that's actually the most useful way to view this, is that, in other words, these authors who we're going to be considering are the propounders, and we're trying to understand what they propounded, which are these systems of tenets, which we then want to hopefully practice and hopefully understand. So I think that's probably the most useful way to view that phrase now that I think about it is, so to think of Vasubandhu as an expounder, to think of Tsongkhapa even as an expounder, but particularly actually, really Tsongkhapa would say, let's look at the Indian expounders as the most important, actually. Because he would say he was just clarifying for future generations what they were saying. So that's my own sense. For the purpose of our study of his text, I actually think that's the most useful, is to think of the expounders of these tenets as really the Indian authors from whom they originated, and that we're trying to come to our own established conclusions in relation to them. Anyway, that's just on a practical level, I think that's the most useful. But we went over a couple minutes, so we should do our dedication. And thanks for posting, Thunder. So we'll do our dedication, and I don't have it in front of me. Is our next class? Thunder probably knows this by heart. Is our next class? It's soon. I can't remember if it's. Just look that up. I remember to say it correctly. Oh yeah, next weekend. So next Saturday we have the follow. And just to be clear, so obviously next week I prepared some, but we didn't get to it yet. So next week, what we'll start is the Vaibhashikas. We'll just dive in and start talking about the Vaibhashika system of tenets. But, and usually we just do these two verses of dedication. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Lauren.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Please stay safe and well.
Yes.
You too.
Thank you.